never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever.
Hey team, this video is about the ventilatory threshold, and a lot of a lot of us, we get mixed up with, okay, what is tempo pace, what is aerobic threshold, what is lactate threshold, i.e. anaerobic threshold, and what is ventilatory threshold. There's two forms of ventilatory threshold. There's VT1, which is, it's identified as the first significant increase in breathing. So we start to deal with much higher amounts of lactic acid, but it's still to a relatively a lower point that it's going to be stressful, but it's not going to be to the point where you're not going to be able to handle that for a significant amount of time. So ventilatory threshold 1 is running around 77 to 81% of your max heart rate. And again, it's going to be, even if you're in great shape, you're going to be able to handle ventilatory threshold training for a significant amount of time. For some athletes, that might mean 20 minutes. For some other athletes, it might mean 40 minutes. It's the second ventilatory threshold. Is the threshold that can also be associated with what has been called your lactate threshold or your anaerobic threshold. That's the point where you're running around 88 to 92% of your maximum heart rate. And so AT pace is much more aggressive. You're building up a much higher amount of lactic acid. And so it's much more of a challenge to be running at your second ventilatory threshold versus running at your first ventilatory threshold. And again, VT1, it's been associated with the upper limit of the zone associated with free fatty acid metabolism, which basically indicates for some athletes the most efficient intensity in terms of weight loss. Okay, now ventilatory 2 threshold is the threshold that can also be associated with your lactate threshold. Okay, this type of intensity clearly shows a disruption in the body's ability to maintain control, and therefore, as athletes, we're going to be challenged. Okay, and that's why I always say it's first you have to learn how to do a 1 to 2 mile anaerobic threshold run before you can think about running 6 to 10 miles or longer. It definitely takes time, especially if you're a long distance runner like a half marathon runner or a marathon runner. So the VT1 threshold is simply the point where our respiratory rate begins to increase. Okay, that's the point where, again, we're building up higher lactic acid, but it's relatively at a point where we can handle it for a longer period of time. And research has shown that our brain starts to work much harder and begins to excrete stress hormones once we're running at VT1 effort. And these stress hormones that occur at the VT1 ventilatory threshold effort starts to break down our body. So again, it's those easy days we really need to stay below our ventilatory threshold. You need to be running at your aerobic threshold. Okay, that's if you look at the math method, the Maffetone method, that's basically taking your age, subtracting 180, your age from 180. So for me at 48, my aerobic threshold at the upper limit is 132 beats per minute. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're running at a much easier, relaxed effort. And again, running at VT1 is stressful, but it's more of running at tempo effort. Okay, tempo effort is slightly slower. A lot of, when we hear about running at tempo effort, a tempo run versus an anaerobic threshold run, tempo runs are slightly slower, around 10 seconds slower than your anaerobic threshold. So again, it could be tempo runs is more running at your VT1 or the ventilatory threshold 1 effort, whereas running at your anaerobic threshold is running at VT2, running at the second ventilatory threshold. Okay, again, this is the point where we really start to get challenged both mentally as well as physically. Running at VT2 effort, your body's requirement for oxygen is much higher versus running at VT1. Okay, anytime you're running above your aerobic threshold, you're going to start really being challenged to be able to sustain goal race pace. And that's, again, why we really focus on working to a point where we can extend that time we spend, especially at the VT2, the ventilatory threshold 2 stage, where you're running at around 88 to 92% of max heart rate. This is very aggressive running, and it does take time for your body to adapt. Remember, if you're having a hard time, say you're right now trying to do 3-mile AT runs, and you're really having a hard time finishing those runs. Maybe you're getting 1 mile into a 3-mile effort and you're having to stop. Okay. One, make sure that you're not running at VO2 max effort. You're not running too anaerobic. That's the reason why it's causing you to significantly, have to slow down or stop. If you're having problems doing a 3-mile tempo run right now, or a 3-mile anaerobic threshold run right now, or tempo run, try first to break it into segments. Okay, maybe it's run a mile, stop and walk for 4 minutes, run another mile, and then try to have another 4-minute break, and then finish the 3-mile, and then work to a point where you can start and finish a 3-mile tempo or anaerobic threshold run altogether. Okay, again, it does take about 28 days for the body to adapt to that. Okay, so you're not going to get quick results, especially running at these very high efforts, running at VT1 or at VT2 effort. Again, when you're running at VT1, again, it's still quicker than an easy run. But it's right around running around tempo pace. It's running, as I mentioned before, around 77 to 81% of max heart rate, or around 60 to 65% of your maximum aerobic speed. Okay, which is essentially how fast you can basically run for 6 minutes, 6 to 10 minutes, around that. Okay, so again, it's more of like if you're focusing on like a chart of 1 to 10 of perceived effort, I would say VT1 is probably around like 4 or 5. Okay, and VT2, which I mentioned earlier, is your ventilatory threshold 2, where you're running closer to more toward your anaerobic threshold or your lactate threshold. That's more close to running around between 6 to 8. VO2 max is like 8 to 10. Okay, VO2 max is your maximum oxygen uptake, where you're running so aggressive, so fast, your body requires so much oxygen that you can't clear it faster than it's building up. So muscle functioning shuts down. You're not going to be able to handle pace for a few minutes. In some cases, a few seconds, depending on if you're doing like all-out 200s or all-out 300s. Okay, with like maybe you'll need much more rest when you're doing all-out efforts. But again, if you're running at VO2 max, much more oxygen is required. The same goes with VT1 and VT2. VT1 is still relatively, it's much more aggressive than easy running, but it's more at a reasonable pace. Whereas your ventilatory threshold 2 is running at your lactate threshold, the point where lactic acid really significantly starts to rise. And we, as athletes, whether you're a middle distance runner or long distance runner, really start to deal with we start to deal with stress. Okay, so this is really about being patient with your training, thinking long term, not trying to rush your fitness. That's why I always talk about focus on a longer build up. Okay, even if you're training for, if you're in high school or in your college, it's much more difficult because you're dealing with different meets throughout the year. In a lot of cases, athletes are really, as a high school and college athlete at one time myself, I was running usually 3 to 4 races every single week, and sometimes 2 times a week, sometimes 3 times a week. Okay, so a lot of times you don't have the luxury of just picking and choosing what races you want to go to. As say somebody that's post-collegiate or somebody that's running professional, they pick the races they want to run, and they pick the time frames they want to train in order to prepare for those races. Okay, so if you're training for a 10-miler, 10K, half marathon, it's better to do a 4 to 6 month block of training, preferably 5 to 6 months, versus a 4 to 12 week build up. Okay, yes, you can still get in relatively good shape in a matter of 8 weeks. 4 weeks is just simply not enough time. 12 weeks is better. But optimal time frame is 4 to 6 months for these longer races. Okay, especially to learn to run effectively at your ventilatory threshold. Okay, because again, this is very challenging. It's not like running at your aerobic threshold where you're running so easily that you can really run that at that pace for 30 minutes to a couple hours or even 3 hours or so, just depending on your fitness level. But when you're running at VT1, it's a little bit more labored, and most definitely you will be challenged at running at ventilatory, your VT2, i.e. your anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold. So I hope this video has been helpful for you in terms of getting to know a little bit more about the different intensities we run at. And again, I've discussed a little bit about the aerobic threshold, your ventilatory threshold, which is running right around like tempo effort, and secondly, the VT2 ventilatory threshold effort, where we're running closer to 88 to 92% of max heart rate, running at that point where lactic acid significantly rises, and we have a much more difficult time being able to run for long periods of time because so much more oxygen is required. And if you haven't built a strong aerobic base and you just jump into trying to do AT runs, you're going to have a very, very difficult time because, again, you just simply haven't built that aerobic base, but you haven't spent enough time running at a higher heart rate with more lactic acid, so build up. Okay, so just be patient with yourself. Your body is going to adapt. You're going to start getting some significant results, especially if you think long-term about this. 4 to 6 months is the way to go. So thank you so much for listening to this video. If you have any other questions, leave me a comment below. I'll definitely respond. If you're wanting to take your training and racing to the next level, I have resources below these videos as well as on RunDreamAchieve.com to definitely help you speed up your recovery and to speed up your success rate. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll talk to you all in the next video.